The old diner on Highway 16 had seen better days. Its neon sign flickered weakly in the afternoon sun, and the parking lot was dotted with potholes big enough to swallow a tire. But the coffee was good and the food was better, which is why Reggie Wilson came here every Sunday after his morning physical therapy. Reggie sat in the corner booth, his weathered hands wrapped around a steaming mug. He was a big man, still muscular despite being in his 40s, with deep brown skin that crinkled around his eyes when he smiled, which wasn't often these days. His cane leaned against the vinyl seat beside him, a constant reminder of what had happened 3 years ago. "More coffee, hon?" asked Betty, the waitress who'd been working at the diner since before Reggie moved to town. "Yes, ma'am." "Thank you," Reggie replied with a polite nod. His voice was deep and quiet, the kind that made people lean in to listen. Most folks in town knew little about him, just that he kept to himself in that small house at the end of Oak Street. What they didn't know was that underneath his faded blue work shirt and the slight limp in his walk was a man who had once been among America's most elite warriors. 15 years as a Navy SEAL had taken Reggie to places most people couldn't find on a map, doing things that would never make the evening news. As Betty refilled his cup, Reggie's eyes automatically scanned the diner, an old habit he couldn't shake. 2 truckers at the counter, a family of 4 by the window, an elderly couple sharing pie. His gaze noted each exit, each potential threat or alley, all without seeming to look up from his plate of steak and eggs. 3 years ago, Reggie had been on his final mission before retirement. Their helicopter had taken heavy fire over a mountainous region thousands of miles from home. He still remembered the sound, the terrible grinding of metal, the shouts of his teammates, then the impact that shattered his leg in 4 places and ended his military career. The doctors had told him he might never walk without assistance again. They didn't know who they were talking to. Reggie took a bite of his steak and thought about the motorcycle parts waiting for him at home. Rebuilding that old Harley had become his therapy, his meditation. The way the parts fit together made sense in a world that often didn't. His physical therapist had told him to find a hobby that would strengthen his hands and keep his mind busy. The motorcycle did both. "You need anything else?" Betty asked, dropping off his check. "No, ma'am, this is perfect," Reggie said, giving her one of his rare smiles. Outside, the rumble of engines grew louder. Not just one motorcycle, but many. The sound made the water in Reggie's glass vibrate slightly, tiny ripples forming on its surface. He didn't look up. In his life before, he'd learned to gather information without showing interest. The pitch and growl of those engines told him these weren't weekend riders on sport bikes. These were heavy machines, probably Harleys, being pushed hard. The other diners glanced nervously toward the windows as the parking lot filled with gleaming chrome and black leather. Betty's face tightened with worry as she hustled behind the counter. Reggie took another bite of his food. His right hand, strong and steady, cut through the steak with precision. His left hand, the one with the small eagle tattoo partially visible beneath his watchband, remained relaxed on the table. To anyone watching, he was just a disheveled black man enjoying a quiet meal alone, perhaps the easiest target in the place. The diner's bell jingled as the door swung open. Heavy boots thumped across the linoleum floor. The smell of leather, cigarettes, and the open road filled the small space. Reggie didn't turn around. He'd faced sandstorms in the desert and ambushes in the jungle. He'd swum through freezing waters and parachuted into absolute darkness. After all he'd seen and done, a few bikers looking for trouble didn't even register as danger. But they didn't know that. They saw only what he allowed them to see, a middle-aged man with a cane, sitting alone. They had no idea they were about to make the biggest mistake of their lives. The diner's door swung open with enough force to rattle the nearby window. 8 men walked in, or strutted, really, their leather vests covered in patches and badges that marked them as the Steel Wolves. Everyone in 3 counties knew about them. They weren't just any bikers, they were the kind that made even the sheriff think twice about pulling them over. Their boots squeaked against the linoleum as they filled the small diner with their presence. The smell of motor oil and leather quickly overpowered the scent of fresh pie and coffee. The family by the window pulled their kids closer. The truckers at the counter suddenly became very interested in their food. Even Betty, who'd been serving tough customers for 20 years, kept her eyes down as she wiped the same spot on the counter over and over. The leader walked in last. They called him Bear, and it wasn't hard to see why. He stood well over 6 feet tall with shoulders like a linebacker and a beard so thick you could lose your fingers in it. His vest had more patches than any of the others, including one that showed a wolf with blood dripping from its teeth. "Afternoon, folks," Bear said, his voice carrying across the diner like thunder. Nobody answered. Nobody ever did. Bear's eyes swept across the diner, looking for the best spot to claim. That's what they did. They didn't just take seats, they claimed territory. His gaze stopped when he spotted Reggie sitting alone in the corner booth, the biggest table in the place, and the one with the best view of both the door and the parking lot. Well, what do we have here?" Bear's mouth twisted into something that wasn't quite a smile. The other bikers spread out behind him like a pack following their alpha. Reggie kept eating. He cut another piece of steak, dipped it in gravy, and put it in his mouth. His movements were unhurried calm. Anyone watching closely might have noticed that he never fully turned his back on the newcomers, that his posture had shifted ever so slightly, his back straightening, his feet now planted firmly on the floor. The bikers moved toward Reggie's table like a slow wave. The rest of the diner went silent. You could have heard a pin drop between the heavy footfalls of their boots. "That's our spot," Bear said, stopping at Reggie's table and planting his massive hands on the edge. His knuckles were scarred, with faded tattoos spelling out pain across one hand and FER across the other. Reggie finished chewing before he looked up. "Didn't see any names on it," he said quietly. The diner got even quieter, if that was possible. The cook peeked through the service window, his face tight with worry. One of the truckers at the counter slowly reached for his phone. "You hear that, boys?" Bear turned to his crew with exaggerated surprise. "Man says he didn't see any names on it." The others chuckled on cue, the sound as comforting as a rattlesnake's warning. One of the younger bikers, they called him Rat because he was skinny with sharp features, moved to the side of the table. "Nice cane you got there," he said, nudging it with his boot. "Real fancy." The cane slid slightly on the smooth floor. Reggie's eyes flickered toward it for just a second. "What happened to your leg anyway?" asked another biker with a shaved head and arms covered in tattoos. "You born like that, or did someone teach you a lesson?" Reggie placed his fork down carefully on his plate. "Afghanistan. Helicopter crash." We got ourselves a hero," Better said, looking back at his boys with a smirk. "A real American hero." He leaned closer to Reggie. "You know what I think about so-called heroes?" Before Reggie could answer, another biker deliberately bumped the table, spilling Reggie's water glass. The cold water spread across the table and dripped onto Reggie's lap. "Oops," the biker said with a yellow-toothed grin. "My bad." Bear's massive frame now blocked most of the light from the window. "See, here's the thing. This is our diner. We come here every Saturday after our ride, and we sit at this table. Been doing it for years." Reggie's eyes never left Bear's face. He didn't reach for napkins to dry himself. He didn't look for his cane. He just sat there, his face as calm as still water. "I think you need to find somewhere else to eat," Bear continued, his voice dropping lower. "Somewhere they serve your kind." The air in the diner seemed to freeze. Betty dropped a coffee mug behind the counter, the crash unnaturally loud in the silence. The old couple who had been sharing pie quietly left money on their table and headed for the door. Reggie slowly pushed his plate away. A normal man might have been scared. A normal man might have tried to leave. But there was something in Reggie's eyes now, something cold and calculating that hadn't been there before. Something that had seen worse men than these in worse places than a roadside diner. "I haven't finished my meal," Reggie said, his voice still quiet but somehow filling the room. "And I don't think you boys know who you're talking to." Bear laughed, a sound like gravel in a blender. "Is that right? And who exactly are we talking to?" He leaned down, bringing his bearded face inches from Reggie's, "because all I see is a man who doesn't know when to move along." The other bikers spread out around the table, forming a wall of leather and attitude. The one they called Rat kicked Reggie's cane further away, sending it skittering across the floor until it hit the far wall. "Oops," Rat said with a snicker. "Guess you're gonna need some help getting up now." Reggie didn't even glance at the cane. "I'd walked through worse than you without it," he said, his voice level. Not loud, not threatening, just matter of fact. A biker with faded tear tattoos under his eye. They called him Weeper not because he cried, but because he made others cry, slammed his palm on the table. You got a mouth on you, don't you? Maybe we need to teach you some respect. The family with kids hurried toward the exit, the mother shielding her children's eyes as if they were passing a car wreck. The truckers at the counter weren't pretending to eat anymore. One had his phone out, thumb hovering over the screen, ready to call for help. Betty stepped forward from behind the counter, her face pale but determined. Now listen here, Bear. You boys can have any table you want, but... Shut it, Betty, Bear growled without looking at her. This ain't your business. Betty's mouth snapped shut, but her eyes flashed with anger and fear. Reggie folded his napkin and placed it beside his plate, the movement precise and controlled. The lady asked you nicely, he said. Maybe you should listen. And maybe you should crawl back to whatever hole you came from, said a biker with a shaved head and a scar that ran from his ear to his chin. They called him Slash for obvious reasons. He reached out and flipped Reggie's plate onto the floor. Gravy and potatoes splattered across the linoleum. Looks like you're done eating now. The cook emerged from the kitchen, a meat cleaver in his hand. He was an old Vietnamese man named Tran who'd owned the diner for 30 years. You go now, he said to the bikers, his accent thick but his meaning clear. No trouble here. Bear turned to look at Tran, amusement dancing in his cold eyes. Put that down before you hurt yourself, old man. This is between us and your customer here. Reggie caught Tran's eye and gave him the smallest shake of his head. Tran hesitated, then lowered the cleaver slightly, though he didn't go back to the kitchen. I'm giving you one chance, Reggie said, looking up at Bear. Take your boys and go find another place to eat. The diner went completely silent. Even the ceiling fan seemed to hold its breath. Then Bear threw back his head and laughed. The other bikers joined in, their laughter bouncing off the walls. You're giving us a chance. Bear wiped a tear from his eye. That's the funniest thing I've heard all day. What are you going to do, hop after us? Reggie's eyes hardened, but his voice remained calm. I won't need to hop. That's enough. A new voice cut through the tension. Everyone turned to see an older man standing up from a booth near the back. He was in his 70s with white hair cut military short and the weathered face of someone who'd seen too much sun and too much trouble. The name patch on his faded army jacket read Wilson. Well, if it isn't Old Man Wilson, Bear said, turning slightly toward the newcomer. This doesn't concern you either, Pops. The old man stepped closer, his back straight despite his age. It does when you're hassling one of our own. He looked at Reggie with recognition in his eyes. You're Thomas Reggie Wilson, aren't you? Navy SEAL, Team 6. A flicker of surprise crossed Reggie's face. I thought so, the old man continued. I was at the VA when they brought you in after that helicopter crash. I heard the doctors talking. 3 Purple Hearts. Silver Star. The works. Bear's smirk faltered slightly. One of the bikers in the back, a stocky guy with a trimmed beard they called Doc because he'd been a medic in the army, whispered something to the others. Don't care if he's Captain America, Bear growled, but there was a new uncertainty in his voice. He's in our spot. Reggie slowly stood up. Even with his bad leg, he was tall eye to eye with Bear. Years of training had built a body that age and injury couldn't completely erase. His shoulders were broad, his arms corded with muscle that the loose shirt couldn't hide. I was sitting here enjoying my meal, Reggie said, his voice still quiet but with an edge of steel now. I fought for this country so people like you could ride your bikes and sit wherever you want. But that doesn't give you the right to push others around. He took a step toward Bear, not leaning on anything, his injured leg supporting him through what must have been considerable pain. So like I said, I'm giving you one chance to walk away. The atmosphere in the diner had changed. The bikers looked at each other uncertainly. Doc had moved closer to Rat, saying something under his breath that made the younger biker's eyes widen. Bear's face flushed red beneath his beard. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not in front of his crew. He straightened up to his full height, his hands curling into fists at his sides. You think being a SEAL makes you untouchable, he snarled. I don't care what you were. In here, you're just a... I'd think real careful about what comes out of your mouth next. Reggie interrupted, his eyes locked on Bear's. Something in those eyes made Bear stop mid-sentence, a glimpse of the man Reggie had been, The man he still was beneath the civilian clothes. A man who had faced death so many times that the threat of a bar fight didn't even register as danger. The whole diner held its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The tension in the diner was thick enough to cut with a knife. Bear's face had turned an angry shade of red beneath his beard. His massive hands were balled into fists at his sides. The other bikers hovered nearby, waiting for a signal from their leader. But before Bear could make a move, the stocky biker with the trimmed beard, Doc, pushed his way forward. "Hold up, Bear," he said, his voice low but firm. "I need a minute here." He stared at Reggie with new interest, like he was seeing him for the first time. "Wilson, Thomas R. Wilson, wait a second." He snapped his fingers as if trying to catch a memory. "The guys in my unit used to talk about a SEAL who pulled out an entire squad under heavy fire. This was back in 2017, Helmand Province." Reggie didn't confirm or deny, but something flickered in his eyes. "That was you, wasn't it?" Doc pressed. The guy said this SEAL had been shot twice but still carried the radio operator over his shoulder for 3 miles to the extraction point. Old man Wilson nodded from where he stood. "That's him all right. 3-day mission turned into a week-long firefight. Command had written the whole squad off as lost, but Wilson here wouldn't leave him." The atmosphere in the diner shifted again. One of the truckers at the counter, a big guy with a Desert Storm cap, was now watching with open interest. Bear wasn't backing down yet. So what? Half the guys who come through here claim to be war heroes. Doesn't mean he can take our table. "It was Wilson," Doc said, more firmly now. "My brother was in that squad. 2nd Battalion, 10th Mountain Division. He told me the story so many times I could recite it in my sleep." He turned to Reggie. "You gave him your last water pack when his ran out. Told him to save it 'cause help was coming, even though no one believed it was." Reggie's stance relaxed slightly, but his eyes remained alert, assessing. "Your brother was the one with the Street Christopher medal," he said. "Kept showing it to me, saying it would get us home." Doc's eyes widened. "Tommy, you remember Tommy?" His voice had lost all its earlier aggression. "I remember all of them," Reggie said simply. The biker called Slash edged closer to Bear. "Who cares about some old war story? We gonna let this guy disrespect us or what?" But the mood had shifted. Rat, the skinny biker who had kicked away Reggie's cane, now looked uncomfortable. He glanced toward where the cane had landed, then back at Reggie. "My cousin came back from over there," he said, his voice quieter now. "Ain't been the same since." Bear sensed he was losing control of the situation. "Don't tell him you boys are going soft over some story," he growled. "This is our diner, our table." "It's my diner," Tran said from behind the counter, still holding his cleaver. "I decide who sits where." Betty added her voice. "That's right. And Reggie's been coming here every Sunday for 2 years, never given us a lick of trouble." The trucker with the Desert Storm cap stood up from his stool. "I was there in 91, he said. "Different war, same sand. You learn real quick who's got your back and who's just talking." He nodded respectfully toward Reggie. "The SEALs were the ones you wanted to see when things went sideways." Another biker, an older guy with gray in his beard they called Pops, stepped forward. "My nephew's a Marine, says the same thing about the SEAL teams." He looked at Bear with a challenge in his eyes. "Maybe we should find another spot today." Bear's face darkened even more. "Since when do we back down because someone tells a sob story about the sandbox?" He turned to Reggie, jabbing a thick finger into his chest. "I don't care what you did over there. This is here, and here, you're nothing." The diner went silent again. Reggie looked down at the finger on his chest, then back up at Bear's face. With a movement almost too quick to follow, Reggie's hand came up and wrapped around Bear's wrist. He didn't twist it or push it away. He just held it in a grip like iron. 10 years ago, Reggie said calmly, "I might have put you through that window for touching me like that." His voice was conversational, as if he was discussing the weather. 5 years ago, I might have broken your arm in 3 places. He released Bear's wrist. Today, I'm just asking you to step back and think about what you're doing. Bear yanked his arm away, but there was a new wariness in his eyes. For the first time, he was seeing the man beneath the disability, the warrior who had survived things Bear couldn't even imagine. The diner's door opened and a town police officer stepped in. He was a young guy, probably still in his 20s, but he carried himself with the caution of someone who knew the biker's reputation. "Everything okay in here, Betty?" he asked, his hand resting casually near his belt. Betty glanced from Bear to Reggie and back again. "Just a little disagreement about seating, Officer Taylor. Nothing we can't sort out." The officer nodded, but he didn't leave. "Well, I'll just grab a coffee while I'm here," he said, moving to the counter but keeping his eyes on the group. Doc had moved closer to Reggie now, almost protective. "Bear, man, let's just take another table. It's not worth it." Old Man Wilson picked up Reggie's cane and brought it over, not handing it to him, but placing it within reach. "My buddy here earned the right to sit wherever he wants," he said. "And you boys might want to think about the fact that he's been sitting here listening to you run your mouths without once reaching for this." He tapped the cane. "A man who can show that kind of restraint is a man you don't want to push too far." The ad crackled with the decision point. Bear stood there, trapped between his pride and the dawning realization that he might have picked the wrong fight with the wrong man. The other bikers were already shifting away, the pack mentality dissolving in the face of a predator they hadn't recognized until too late. Finally, Bear took a half step back. "We'll take the booth by the window," he said to Betty, his voice gruff. "Bring us some coffee." It wasn't quite an apology, but it was as close as a man like Bear could get to admitting he'd made a mistake. As the bikers moved away, Doc lingered. "My brother still has that medal," he said quietly to Reggie. "Says he owes his kid's existence to you." He hesitated, then extended his hand. "Thank you. For what it's worth." Reggie looked at the offered hand for a long moment, then reached out and shook it firmly. The diner slowly returned to normal. Betty brought fresh coffee to Bear and his crew at their new table by the window. Tran went back to the kitchen, the cleaver safely stowed away. Officer Taylor sat at the counter, sipping his coffee but keeping one eye on the bikers. Reggie eased back into his seat. His face showed no pain, but Old Man Wilson noticed the slight tremor in his hand as he reached for his water glass. "Leg's acting up, isn't it?" the old vet asked quietly. Reggie gave a small nod. "Weather's changing. Always feels it coming." "Same with my shoulder," Wilson said, rolling it slightly. "Took a piece of shrapnel outside Sagan, 68. Doctors said I'd never lift my arm above my head again." He demonstrated by raising his arm fully. "Showed them, same as you're showing these doctors of yours." Tran appeared with a fresh plate of food for Reggie. "On house," he said with a slight bow. "Thank you for not breaking anything." His serious expression cracked into a smile. "Last time bikers caused trouble, I need new windows." From across the diner, Doc was in deep conversation with Bear and the others. Their voices were low, but their glances toward Reggie's table made it clear who they were talking about. After a few minutes, Doc got up and walked back over. "Mind if I sit?" he asked, gesturing to the empty chair across from Reggie. Reggie studied him for a moment, then nodded. Doc settled into the chair. Up close, his face showed the weathered lines of someone who'd spent too much time in the sun. A faded tattoo on his forearm showed a medical caduceus. "Army medic?" Reggie asked, nodding toward the tattoo. "4 tours," Doc confirmed. "Fixed up a lot of boys who got themselves broken." He leaned forward. "Including a few SEALs, though most of you guys were too stubborn to admit when you needed patching up." A ghost of a smile crossed Reggie's face. "Part of the training. If you can still breathe, you can still fight." "My brother Tommy," Doc said, shaking his head slightly. "He still wakes up some nights thinking he's back there. Says he can smell the dust and hear the choppers." He looked directly at Reggie. "But he's alive to have those nightmares because of men like you." Reggie cut a piece of his steak, his movements precise. "We all did what we had to do." "Bear's not a bad guy," Doc said, glancing back at his leader. "Just hard-headed. Most of us rode together after getting out. Couldn't settle back into normal life, you know. Out there, everything made sense. Back here, he trailed off." "I know," Reggie said simply. From the window table, the other bikers were watching the conversation. The youngest one, Rat, looked particularly uncomfortable. Finally, he stood up and walked over, carrying Reggie's cane. I shouldn't have messed with this," he said, carefully placing the cane against the table. "My uncle came back from Iraq missing half his foot. Always said his cane was like another limb. I shouldn't have." He swallowed hard. "I'm sorry, man." Reggie looked at the young biker. There was no anger in his eyes, just a steady assessment. "What's your real name, kid?" "Pete," the young man answered, surprised by the question. "Pete Donovan." "Well, Pete Donovan," Reggie said, apology accepted. "But you might want to think about who you're trying to be. That jacket you're wearing, you haven't earned all those patches yet, have you?" Pete's face flushed. "Been riding with them for 6 months. Hoping to get my full colors this year." "Make sure it's worth it," Reggie said. "The company you keep shapes who you become." From across the diner, Bear watched the exchange with mixed emotions playing across his face. Pride warred with a grudging respect. Finally, he stood up and walked over, his massive frame casting a shadow over the table. The atmosphere tensed again. Wilson shifted slightly, ready to stand if needed. Even Officer Taylor set down his coffee cup, suddenly alert. But Bear surprised them all. He pulled up a chair and sat down heavily. For a long moment, he just stared at Reggie. Then he extended his huge hand across the table. "Seems I misjudged the situation," he said, the words clearly difficult for him. "I respect a man who stands his ground. Even more, I respect what you did for our boys over there." Reggie looked at the offered hand, the same one that had been balled into a fist minutes earlier, the one with FER tattooed across the knuckles. Then he reached out and shook it. The entire diner seemed to exhale in relief. "My nephew's over there now," Bear said awkwardly. "Marine. Young kid, too eager to prove himself. Writes home about the Special Forces guys he sees coming and going from the base. Says they're the only ones who don't look scared all the time." Reggie nodded. "Fear's not the problem. It's what you do with it that matters." "That's what I tell my boys," Bear said, gesturing toward his crew. "We got rules in our club. Respect has to be earned." His eyes met Reggie's. "You've earned it." The trucker in the Desert Storm cap raised his coffee mug in a silent toast. Betty smiled from behind the counter. Even Tran peeked out from the kitchen with approval. "We ride for the Veterans Hospital every third Sunday," Bear continued, surprising himself with the invitation forming in his words. "Visiting the guys nobody else visits. Maybe you'd want to join us sometime." For the first time since they'd entered the diner, Reggie's face softened into a genuine smile. "I'd like that," he said. "But I ride my own bike." Bear's eyebrows shot up. "You ride? With your?" He gestured awkwardly toward Reggie's leg. "Customized her myself," Reggie said, a hint of pride in his voice. 1200 Harley Sportster. Modified the controls so I can shift without putting weight on my bad side. Bear's face broke into a grin. "Well, I'll be damned." As the conversation continued, the last of the tension melted away. What had started as a confrontation was transforming into something unexpected, a connection between men who had more in common than they'd realized. Veterans from different eras, riders from different worlds, finding common ground over coffee and stories that only those who had been there could truly understand. Outside, the afternoon sun broke through the clouds, sending streams of light through the diner windows. The shadows that had seemed so threatening before now softened, painting the scene in a warm glow that felt almost like forgiveness. 2 hours had passed, and the diner looked nothing like it had during the tense standoff. Plates of half-eaten burgers and empty coffee cups cluttered the tables that had been pushed together to make room for the unlikely gathering. Reggie sat at the center, his cane hooked over the back of his chair, forgotten for now. "So there we were," Bear was saying, his hands painting pictures in the air, middle of nowhere, Nevada. Bikes busted, no cell service, and this dust storm rolling in that looked like the end of days. The bikers nodded, having heard this story before but enjoying it nonetheless. Even Officer Taylor had joined the group, his coffee long gone cold as he listened. "And this old cowboy pulls up in a truck that's older than dirt," Bear continued. "Looks at us, looks at our bikes, and says, 'You boys wouldn't happen to know how to deliver a calf, would you?'" Laughter rippled around the table. Reggie's deep chuckle joined in, his face more relaxed than it had been in months. "Next thing we know, we're up to our elbows in, well, you can imagine," Bear concluded with a grin. "But we got that calf out alive, and the old man let us sleep in his barn and fixed my bike the next morning. Turned out he'd been a mechanic in Korea." "Funny how life works that way," Old Man Wilson said, nodding. "Strangers becoming friends because life throws you together." Betty brought another round of coffee, refusing Bear's attempt to pay. "On the house for veterans," she insisted. My daddy was at Iwo Jima. He always said the men who served together shared something nobody else could understand. A comfortable silence settled over the group, the kind that comes when people recognize a truth too deep for words. Through the windows, the afternoon light had taken on the golden quality of approaching sunset. You mentioned you work with young vets, Doc said to Reggie. What exactly do you do? Reggie shifted in his seat, unused to talking about himself. Nothing official. Just help guys who are having trouble adjusting back to civilian life. Find jobs, deal with the VA, that sort of thing. He's being modest, Old Man Wilson cut in. He runs a whole program out of his garage. Teaches them to rebuild motorcycles. Gives them something to focus on besides the memories. It's just tinkering, Reddy said with a shrug. Guys come back with skills the civilian world doesn't understand. Put a wrench in their hands, suddenly they remember they know how to solve problems. Bear leaned forward, interest sparking in his eyes. How many vets you working with? 5 right now, Reggie answered. Could take more, but space is tight. And parts are expensive. What kind of parts you need? Asked the biker they called Pops. I got a shed full of Harley pieces I've been collecting for years. Wife's been telling me to clear it out. And I work at the salvage yard out on Route 16, Pete, formerly known as Rat, added eagerly. Boss lets me take stuff that's gonna be junked anyway. Reggie looked surprised by the offers. That'd be helpful, he said, a bit awkwardly. One of my guys is rebuilding a 92 Softail, needs a new transmission. Got one, Pop said immediately. Pulled it from my cousin's bike after he laid it down last year. Engine was shot, but the transmission's fine. The conversation shifted into technical details about motorcycles. The bikers leaned in, offering parts, expertise, connections to mechanics who owed them favors. With each suggestion, the distance between them and Reggie shortened, replaced by the easy camaraderie of men who spoke the same language of engines and steel. As they talked, Betty brought out a fresh pie, setting it in the middle of the table with a stack of plates. Trent says you're not leaving until you try his wife's apple pie, she announced. Best in the county. Doc's phone buzzed. He checked it, then looked at Bear. Time for us to head out if we're gonna make it to Mike's place before dark. A wave of disappointment passed over the table. Strangely, none of the bikers seemed eager to leave. Where's your place? Bear asked Reggie. The one with the garage workshop. East side of town, Reggie replied. Little blue house on Cedar Street. Can't miss it. Got an American flag and a Navy flag out front. Bear nodded, committing it to memory. He stood up and the other bikers followed suit, reaching for wallets to settle their bills. Next Sunday, Bear said, not quite a question and not quite a command. The VA ride. You should come. Bring your guys if they're up for it. Reggie considered this. Some of them don't do well in crowds, he said carefully. Loud noises, too many people. We understand, Doc said quietly. More than you might think. He tapped his temple. Not all wounds are visible, right? Tell you what, Bear said. We'll swing by your place first. Meet your guys, let them get comfortable with us before the big ride. No pressure. Reggie nodded slowly. That could work, he said. Around 10? 10 it is, Bear confirmed, reaching out to shake Reggie's hand again. This time, there was no hesitation on either side. The bikers filed out, their leather jackets catching the golden sunlight as they stepped onto the parking lot. Through the window, Reggie watched as they mounted their bikes. Bear said something to the group, then raised his hand in a salute toward the diner before starting his engine. The sound of motorcycles filled the air, but this time it didn't feel threatening. It sounded almost like a promise. Well, Old Man Wilson said, watching the bikers ride away, guess you made some new friends today. Reddy smiled slightly. Guess I did. Betty began clearing the dishes. Those boys needed someone like you, she said softly. They've been riding around like they're still at war. Maybe now they'll find their way home. Reggie reached for his cane, wincing slightly as he stood. The long day had taken its toll on his leg. But as he paid his bill and headed for the door, his steps seemed lighter somehow, as if he'd set down a burden he'd been carrying for too long. Sometimes, he thought, the bridges we need are built in the strangest of ways, by the most unexpected of architects. The morning sun cast long shadows across Reggie's driveway as he wiped his hands on an old rag. The 92 Softail was finally taking shape, its chrome parts gleaming after hours of polishing. He'd been up since dawn, too restless to sleep. Something about yesterday at the diner had stirred up feelings he thought he'd buried long ago, a sense of purpose, of belonging. The sound of his phone buzzing pulled him from his thoughts. A text from one of his vets, cancelling today's session. The nightmares had come back. Reggie sighed, understanding all too well. 3 steps forward, 2 steps back, that was how recovery worked. He was about to head inside when he heard it, the distant rumble of motorcycles. Not just 1 or 2, but many, growing louder by the second. His body tensed automatically, old instincts kicking in. But then he remembered Bear's words at the diner, "Maybe we'll stop by sometime." He hadn't expected sometime to mean the very next day. The bikes appeared at the end of his street, 5, no, 7 of them. Bear's massive chopper led the pack, its black paint catching the sunlight. Behind him rode Doc, Pete, and the others from the diner, plus a couple of faces Reggie didn't recognize. They pulled into his driveway and killed their engines, the sudden silence almost as loud as the bikes had been. For a moment, no one moved. Then Bear swung his leg over his bike and walked toward Reggie, carrying something heavy in his arms. "Morning," Bear said with a nod that somehow managed to be both casual and respectful. "Hope it's not too early for visitors." "Never too early," Reggie answered. "Coffee's hot if you want some." Bear grinned. "Maybe later. Right now, we brought you something." He held out what he'd been carrying, a transmission, cleaned and rebuilt, gleaming in the morning light. "Pops said you needed this for the Softail. We worked on it half the night to make sure it's right." Reggie stared at the part, then at the men watching him from their bikes. Yesterday, they'd been strangers. Worse, they'd been threats. Today, they were on his driveway, offering him exactly what he needed. He cleared his throat. "That's mighty kind of you." Pete, no longer Rat in Reggie's mind, hopped off his bike, pointing to the pickup truck that had followed them. "That's not all. Boss gave me permission to bring you some parts from the yard. Handlebars, couple of gas tanks, some decent seat leather." The truck backed into the driveway, and 2 more bikers Reggie hadn't met began unloading boxes of parts. One box was filled with tools, high-quality wrenches and specialized motorcycle gear that Reggie had always wanted but could never afford. "What's all this?" Reggie asked, genuinely confused by the generosity. Doc stepped forward. "Called my brother last night. Told him I met you." His voice grew serious. "He cried, man. Actually cried on the phone. Said he's been trying to find you for years to say thank you." Reggie looked away, uncomfortable with the gratitude. "Just did my job." "That's what all you guys say," Doc replied. "My brother's got 3 kids now. Oldest one's named Thomas, after you." The other bikers had gathered around now, forming a loose circle in Reggie's driveway. Some of them wore veteran patches on their vests. Army, Marines, 1 Air Force. "We took a vote last night," Bear said, his voice gruff but warm. "Our club's been looking for a purpose beyond just riding and raising hell. Your program for vets, we want to help." Reggie blinked, caught off guard. "I don't understand." "We've got skills," Bear continued. "Mechanics, welders, painters. Pete here's good with computers, could set you up a website, maybe help with fundraising." He gestured to the gray-bearded biker they called Pops. "And he used to own a shop before his knees gave out. Could teach these young vets a thing or two. Plus," Doc added with a smile, "we know how to have fun. These guys coming back, they need to remember how to enjoy life again. Nothing better than the open road for clearing a troubled mind." Reggie looked at his little workshop. For 3 years, he'd been doing what he could with limited resources, helping a handful of vets at a time. What these men were offering could transform everything. "Why?" he asked simply. "Why would you do this?" Bear exchanged glances with his crew, then looked back at Reggie. "Because yesterday in that diner, you could have taken us apart. I saw it in your eyes. You had every right to, after how we treated you." He took a deep breath. "But instead, you showed us respect. Showed us another way." The big man looked almost vulnerable for a moment. "We're all looking for a mission, something that matters. What you're doing here, that matters." From inside the garage came a sound, the creak of the side door opening. A young man in his 20s appeared, thin and wary-eyed. One of Reggie's vets, 2 tours in Iraq, dealing with PTSD so bad he rarely left his apartment. Everything okay, Reggie? The young man asked, eyeing the bikers with suspicion. Everything's fine, Will, Reggie assured him. These are some new friends. They're here to help with the bikes. Will hesitated, still uncertain. Pete stepped forward, recognizing the look in the younger vet's eyes. He'd seen it in his cousins. You working on anything in there? Pete asked casually. I brought some parts that might be useful. Will's eyes shifted to the boxes of motorcycle parts. I've been trying to rebuild a Honda. Keep getting stuck on the electrical system. Pete's face lit up. That's my specialty. Mind if I take a look? After a moment's hesitation, Will nodded and stepped aside, letting Pete enter the garage. The ice was broken. Over the next hour, Reggie's quiet property transformed. Bikers and vets mingled in the garage, speaking the universal language of engines and gear ratios. 2 more of Reggie's guys showed up, drawn by the unusual activity. To Reggie's surprise, they didn't retreat from the noise and strangers. Instead, they were soon deep in conversation with men who understood exactly what they'd been through. By afternoon, plans were being made. The Steel Wolves would come every Saturday. They'd expand the workshop, maybe build a proper shelter for more bikes. Bear was already talking about fundraising rides, charity events for the VA hospital. As the sun began to set, Reggie found himself sitting on his porch steps beside Bear, watching the unlikely brotherhood that had formed in his driveway. Never thought I'd see the day, Reggie said quietly. Yesterday you were ready to put me through a wall. Bear chuckled. Yesterday I was an idiot. He looked at Reggie with newfound respect. Life's funny that way. Sometimes your worst moments lead to your best decisions. Inside the garage, laughter erupted as one of the vets told a story, surrounded by men in leather vests who were hanging on every word. Look at that, Bear said, nodding toward the sound. That right there, that's the real mission, bringing the lost ones home. Reggie nodded, a weight lifting from his shoulders that he hadn't even realized he'd been carrying. For years after his injury, he'd felt disconnected, set apart by what he'd seen and done. But watching these men, different ages, different wars, different wounds, finding common ground in his garage, he finally understood. Sometimes family isn't what you're born into. Sometimes it's what you build, piece by piece, from the broken parts life leaves behind.